Hey guys, so today we're going to be talking about a couple advanced Python topics, one being Lambda functions, the other being list methods. We're also going to talk about how we can combine these new tools to improve our developer code. All right, let's get at it. So the first question to answer would be, what are Lambda functions? So Lambda functions are functions that we create for use in a limited capacity or limited scope. They are functions that actually have no name in our code. This is the reason they're often referred to as anonymous functions. But other terminology that you might hear include inline functions or function literals. Just know that all of these names are synonymous with Lambda functions in Python. Lambda functions are very similar to fat arrow functions from JavaScript. So if you're familiar with those, you shouldn't have too much trouble adapting to Lambda functions in Python. Finally, Lambda functions actually get their names from lambda calculus. Now, I have no idea what lambda calculus is. That's probably a lecture for another time. But for now, let's stick to our code. All right, so let's actually take a look at the basic syntax and a sample usage of lambda functions. So I have a very simple coding example here. I have a lambda function on my first line, and I assign that to a variable called double func. And then on the next two lines, I actually use that function by passing a parameter in it, storing the return value, and then print that value out. Note that this is identical to how you would use a normal function, so the syntax is not very different for usage. But there are some keys to the syntax for lambda functions. So let's take a closer look at those. So first, to declare a lambda function, we use the lambda keyword that I've highlighted here. Next, we have a list of parameters or arguments. Note that these, you can name this variable whatever you want. Also note that you could pass 0, 1, 2, as many parameters as you want or don't want. It's kind of up to you, just like functions. Next, we have a colon that separates our parameter list from our return expression. So our return expression is that value that we're actually returning from this lambda function. Note that we don't have to include the return keyword in order to return this expression. All right, so those are the three basic components of a lambda expression. We have the keyword, we have an argument list, and then we have a return expression. All right, and as I said, once you have a lambda function, you could use it just like any other function. Here I have my double func. I'm passing in a value of 7, which should return 14, since I'm just doubling the value that's passed in, and then I'm just printing that value out. All right. Let's look at a few more examples, just so we're more familiar with lambda syntax. So my first example, I actually have no parameters that I'm passing to my lambda function. So as you can see here, I have the lambda keyword, and I have the colon right after with no parameters after the lambda keyword. This lambda function is basically just printing out no parameter out to the console. So that's what my lambda function is doing here. I'm assigning that to a variable, and then I could call a lambda function by adding parentheses. Again, this is the same as if you were calling a normal function that takes in no parameters. All right, my second example is where I pass in one parameter. In this case, my parameter's name is A. In this case, my lambda function is just checking to see if the input parameter is greater than the value of 7. So again, I'm storing this to a variable, and then I could call my function like any other function. And in this case, if I pass in the value of 8, I should return true for my function because 8 is greater than 7. All right, and then my final example that I have here is a case where I'm passing in more than one parameter. In this case, you want to separate your parameters with commas. So in this case, my parameters are A, B, and C. And then my function simply adds A, B, and C together, and that's to return a value from my lambda function. So in this case, if I call add 3 numbers with 2, 5, and 9, that should return the correct answer, which in this case would be 16. All right, so I've highlighted again the key components of lambda syntax. Again, the lambda keyword is highlighted in a shade of pink. Parameters are displayed in orange, and then the return expression is in a cyan. All right, so hopefully you're familiar with lambda syntax now. Let's talk about why do we use lambda functions. So the two main reasons that I would have to offer would be, one, they're convenient. You can kind of just create a function on the fly. you don't have to really declare it ahead of time. Also, it winds up being less code clutter, especially if you have a function that's only going to be used in one place. It usually makes sense to create a Lambda function, if possible, rather than declaring a function that's only going to be used in a limited scope. However, Lambda functions in Python actually have a key limitation in that their expression can only be a single line. So if you need a function that has multiple expressions in it, you won't be able to use Lambda functions for that. Now, reason for this would be Python is actually space delimited, not semicolon delimited like other languages such as JavaScript or C++. Therefore, I believe that's the reason why Lambda functions can only be one line. Yep. All right, so let's move on to talking about list methods in Python. So there's three main list methods I want to focus on because these are going to be very useful in your development. The first is map. Map is a list method that actually creates a brand new list based on a mapping function that you pass to it, and we'll see this shortly. We also have filter, which creates a new list based on a criteria function that you pass to it. And finally, we have reduce, which returns actually a single value based on an aggregator function that you pass to reduce. All right, so let's actually take a look at some coding examples where we can take advantage of list methods and Lambda functions to see how they can impact our code. All right, so I'm going to go to my coding window here. As you can see, I have some code written up. So my first example, I have a function called add10, and then I have a for loop that actually goes through my initial list, calls add10 for each item, and for that new item, I append that into my new list. All right, so let's actually see how we could use list methods to make this a little more concise, and then we'll add in Lambda functions. All right, so if I wanted to change this, I'm going to add code here. So if I wanted to use list methods, I could do this instead. I could call the map method. And in this case, I will pass in a function. So in this case, I'm going to use add10 as my function. And then I'm going to pass in my list. So map takes in two parameters. The first is your mapping function, and the second will be your list that you want to iterate through. And then this actually returns a mapped object. So I want to connect that to a list. And in this case, I want to print that out also. All right, so I'm going to add a print statement. All right, so again, this and this are doing the same thing, but I'm still using my add10 function. But instead, if I didn't want to have that function, because again, I'm only using it in one place in this case, it would make sense to use a Lambda function here. So let's actually use a Lambda function. So in this case, I'll use the keyword Lambda, pass in one parameter of item, and then my return will simply be this. So again, instead of having a function declared and using a for loop, I can do all of this in one single line. And these two blocks of code are doing the same exact thing. So as we can see here, using list methods and Lambda functions, our code can become much more concise. So if I actually ran this, just to show that it's actually doing the same thing. All right, so Python. All right, as you can see, we got the same result. In this case, it's a list with all the values plus 10. All right, so that's an example of map. Again, map takes in two parameters, the first being a mapping function, which is my Lambda function in this case. And the second parameter will be your actual list that you want to iterate through. All right, so that was map. Let's take a look at filter. So I have some code here for filter. So in this case, I'm going through my original list. I have a function declared called filter odds, which will basically return true if the item passed in is actually odd. And then my for loop will call filter odds for each item. And then if that item is actually odd, it will append it to my new list. So again, this isn't a wrong way to do this, but if you want to see how list methods and Lambda functions can make this much more concise, let's code that up. So in this case, I'll create filter list. In this case, I'll use the filter function, and this takes in two parameters also. So I'm going to actually pass in or create a Lambda function here. It takes in one parameter of item, and this will return item mod 2, 1. So in this case, if it's odd, it should return true. And then the second parameter for my filter method is my actual list. So again, this returns filtered objects. In this case, I actually want it to be a list, so I'm going to create a list from that object that's returned. And again, both these blocks of code are doing the same thing. Again, we have several lines of code here. We declare a function, we use a for loop, and then append to a new list. Or we could do that in one simple line using the filter list method and using a lambda function instead of creating a function that's only used in one place. All right, so if you ran this, just to show that it's using the same thing. Yep, in this case, we get a list with only the odd items being filtered into our new list. All right, so the last list method that I want to talk about is reduce. So I have that down here. So reduce, again, it's maybe less often used than map and filter are, but it's worth knowing about in case you find a use case for it. In this case, all I'm doing is going to my list and aggregating the sum to my reduce result. So again, yeah, this isn't too many lines of code, but I just want to show an example of using reduce. So in this case, we actually got to import from function tools. So reduce is no longer a built-in function for Python 3, which is why we get to import it. So I'm going to import reduce. And then if I want to use it, I can do it pretty easily. So I'm going to call my reduce list method, pass in a function. So in this case, my lambda needs two parameters. The first is an aggregator. The second will be an item. So again, when you have multiple parameters, you just separate them with commas. Then I have my colon, and then my return statement and simply ag plus item. And my second parameter here will be my list. So, all right, so just go over reduce. Reduce actually expects a function that takes in two arguments. Ag is the running total, and then item is each item from your list that's going to be passed in. So that's why we have ag plus item here, which will be stored into ag automatically by the reduce method. All right, so this should print out the same value. So let me print that out. Let's compare. Bring up my terminal here. All right, there's my terminal. Run Python. All right, yep, we get 55 for both. So again, they both do the same thing. One's not more right than the other, but again, for concise code, generally better to use list methods when they make sense and lambda functions when they make sense. Again, lambda functions, their limitation is that you can only have one line of your return expression. If you need multiple lines, then you will actually have to use a separate function. All right, so that's just an introduction into lambda functions and list methods and how you can use them to make your code more concise. All right, so hopefully you find a good use case for them and can employ them into your code. All right, thanks guys.